Hello, this is Andy from Andy's Amateur Adventures, and welcome to my channel. Today I'll be going over how to finish off some giant Jenga pieces. So this is a project I got from my neighbor. She cooked some meals for one of her previous neighbors, and he paid her with making her some giant Jenga pieces, apparently. Unfortunately, he did not finish off the giant Jenga pieces. So if you want to make your own giant Jenga pieces, you need to finish them off, or else you won't be able to play correctly with them because they'll be too high friction and you'll just knock over the tower very early in the game. If you want to make your own, just remember that the length needs to be 3 times the width. So the most popular one to make them out of is 2x4s. So there are 2 main types of 2x4s. There's the most common, which are not true 2x4s. They are more 1 7/8 by 3 3/4. What I mean by that is that they are 1 7/8 inch is deep by 3 3/4 inches wide. Now you can buy true 2x4s, which actually are a full 2 inches deep by 4 inches wide. However, they are less common and they typically cost more. So the ones you get at your store typically will be 3 3/4 inches wide. You just need to measure it, and when you make them, you're making 54 pieces, and the length needs to be 3 times the width. So whatever you got, a regular 2x4 or a true 2x4, measure it and cut the length to just be 3 times that width. And typically you'll need about 6 8-foot pines of them to actually make all 54 of the pieces. Moving on. So in this demonstration, I'm using a palm rotary sander in order to sand all these woods. I'm using that in this demonstration because I believe if you're looking up a video on how to for finishing off some giant Jenga pieces, you're probably not a master carpenter and you probably haven't invested in a bench sander. You may have a belt sander that's you hold by hand. That's not exactly ideal for this job because the pieces of wood are a little bit too small. You'll probably throw them out. However, if you do have a belt sander that is a bench mount, then that is perfect for this job and it's actually ideal for this job. However, not many people have that outside of professional carpenters or extreme hobbyists that are probably already familiar with how to finish off wood. So I use the palm rotary sander because it's more common and more people have it. So I started off, I did a rough sanding and I did a smooth sanding. The rough sanding, I used 110 grit sandpaper, and that was my initial sanding. It was the most time consuming sanding, and then after I did the sanding with 110 grit sandpaper, then I went to the 220 grit sandpaper, which you see me picking up. I started out outside because I do not own a garage and I do not have an inside workspace, so I was kind of stuck doing it outside. And the wind blew everything around initially, so I set things aside and put them up. So I am using a portable table saw as my bench. It is a nice flat surface. It did shake a little bit, but this isn't exactly precision work, so it's perfectly fine that it shook just a little bit. You just need some sort of flat, steady surface that you can work on. Now I'm finally grabbing piece number 2 and getting at it. You can even kind of see how rough it is in the video, even though the video isn't the highest quality. So I just start at one side and I work my way around. You may have noticed in the last piece, I ensured that I got every side and I also got the edges. You need to ensure that you round the edges when you're making these giant Jenga pieces. If you look at regular size Jenga pieces, their edges are slightly rounded. Though those roundings scale up slightly when you make these giant Jenga pieces. And if you don't round the edges, when you try to actually play the game, you'll notice that the pieces will bind on each other and you won't get a nice long game while you're playing them. So after you finish the sanding with 110 grit, you go immediately into sanding with the 210 grit paper. That one actually went a lot faster. It spent 30 seconds to 45 seconds per piece, so about an hour total once you factor changing out sandpaper, stuff like that. when I was doing the rough sand, I went through one piece of sandpaper, roughly 10 pieces of wood, just because these were so rough. That's when I noticed that the sanding was slowing down. When I used the 210 sandpaper, I was able to use 2 pieces of the sandpaper to make it all the way through. Once I finished sanding with the 210, then I took out my shop vac and I vacuumed off all the pieces to make sure that there were no dust in there prior to me actually finishing them. I finished them with polyurethane. Now if you don't have a shop vac, that's fine. It is faster with a shop vac. All you need to do is take a damp cloth and wipe down every piece with a damp cloth. It needs to be damp because the dampness attracts all the sand. And once you wipe it down with a damp cloth, you do need to set them out and let them dry before you try to finish them. And once they're dry and they're clean, then you're good to go to the finishing. I use polyurethane to finish mine. You do not have to. You can also use satin or wood wax. I use polyurethane because I think it gives the best finish. Now I do not stain my wood before I finish it. If you want to stain it, that adds extra steps to the process and also extra time. This is a multi-day process, so just be cognizant of that. It will take several days in order to finish. Now once I finish this second piece of wood, which I'm almost done with, then I'll speed up the playback speed so this video won't take forever. Now I did end up losing a lot of footage. It's not that it got corrupted, I am just a bad cameraman. So I took the camera off the tripod and I attempted to film it while I was wearing it as the same way that you would wear a headlamp with the mount on my head. I didn't get the cant right, so you really couldn't see what was going on. But I did get the first batch of 54 things sanded, so I'll just continue playing that. I also got a little bit of the pieces as they were drying after I got the first coat of polyurethane on it, and also when they were finished after the second coat. So when you're going in between, or when you're doing your polyurethane coats or your finishing coats, whatever type you're doing, you want to move indoors somewhere. I made the mistake of attempting it outdoors. It did not work out well. There was a lot of sand and stuff that flew around, and I saw it in the finished product when it was done drying for the first layer, and I ended up having to sand it down and restart. So if that does happen to you, just remember you can always restart. It's a bit of a pain, I get it, but it does show in your product in the end. I just took out the 110 sandpaper again, sanded off all the pieces that wouldn't brush off, then I was able to go ahead straight at it. I didn't have to sand it with a 220 again. I was able to take my shop vac and clean it off again. So then I went inside and I painted it with polyurethane. Little tip of the trade, if you're working with finishing products or stains inside, use some aluminum foil and actually set the piece of wood on the aluminum foil and paint the top side and the edge sides, and then set them aside to let them dry, and do the final side last. You do this because any piece of the polyurethane or the stain will fall onto the aluminum foil, but it won't permeate or penetrate the aluminum foil, and it won't mess up your countertops, and it won't mess up whatever piece of furniture you're actually standing on, if you're standing on a piece of furniture as a table or something like that. Now you don't want to let your polyurethane completely dry before you flip it over and you do the other side. So I let it dry for 6 hours, and then I flipped it over, and then I did the other side. After my first coat, I realized I messed up because I set it on the aluminum foil again and then painted the other side and let it dry completely. That messed up because there was some pooling on the other side, and I ended up having to sand off the polyurethane completely and restart because the pooled polyurethane was no bueno. It was very thick, very gloppy on the wood. But if that happens to you, just realize that again you can sand it off and restart. That is fine. So set your pieces of wood on aluminum foil, paint them all sides but the last bottom side, let it dry for 6 hours, and then go ahead and flip them over off the pieces of aluminum foil and paint the very last side, and then set them to the side, letting that one last side set up. It's okay that the other side isn't 100% completely set. It is dry enough that it will not smudge onto your countertops or something even though you are setting it directly onto your countertops and not onto the aluminum foil again. If you're still worried about your countertops, then take a fresh piece of aluminum foil and put it on a fresh piece of aluminum foil. I did not do that because I had already used like a lot of aluminum foil because I initially started out outside and then went inside when a dust storm hit. So I did record over 12 hours of video. Most of it was unusable because, as I said, I attempted to wear my GoPro as a headlamp and it just didn't work out well, and I didn't really get any good footage for you guys to see. But that reemphasizes that this is not a fast process. You need to take your time. You can't just do it in one afternoon. I started at a Friday evening and I finished on a Monday morning. And I did work on it at least for a few hours every day in between. But a lot of the time that was spent was letting the coats dry. So yes, you do need to use more than one coat of your finishing material, and you do need to let it dry in between. What I did, the top side, then the other edge sides, let it dry for 6 hours. Then I flipped it over, and then I did the very bottom side while it was sitting up. After that, you need to let it sit for a full 24 hours and let it harden. You'll know when it's ready when you touch it and it does not feel tacky. If it feels a little bit tacky, a little bit sticky, let it dry longer. You can speed it up by putting it in a hot environment, turning on a fan and putting it on it. Put that fan on low, don't put it on high. You can also set it on top of your stove and turn the stove on and let the radiated heat help to do it. Don't actually put it inside of your oven though. So those are some tricks to help it dry faster. They're not really recommended. The best way to let it dry is to let it just sit there. In between coat 1 and coat 2, you do need to sand it again. Now you do a light sanding in between coat 1 and coat 2. And by that I mean you only let the sander hit it for a few seconds at any one given place. It takes about 30 seconds per piece of wood when you're sanding, or when you're doing this second sanding. You're only taking the very, very edge of the polyurethane off when you're doing this in-between sanding. And yes, you do need to whip out the shop vac or the rag and clean it off after you're done with this in-between sanding and before you put on the second coat of your polyurethane or whatever material you're using. You follow the same steps for the second coat that you did for the first coat, and again, let it dry for a full 24 hours. If you look at it and you like the finish, then you're done. Congratulations, you can play Jenga. Again, let it sit for a full 24 hours before you actually play on it. But if you want, you can do a third coat. Some people say you need to do it. I won't say you need to do it. I didn't do it for this one, and it turned out just fine. My neighbor was very happy with the finished product. And I am almost done going through this first batch of sanding, so I'll let the music play and I'll come back in once I'm done with this batch of sanding. So here we are inside. This is what the pieces of wood look like after the first coat, and this is where I messed up and I set them back on the original pieces of aluminum foil, as I said before, and I ended up having to sand off the bottom piece and recoat the bottom part because there was some pulled polyurethane. And you can see the Minwax polyurethane that I used on this. That is the fast set one, and this is a little trick of the trade. Wrap your paintbrush in some plastic wrap. If you're just letting it set overnight, you don't have to completely wash it off and whatever. It just keeps your paintbrush from drying and hardening overnight when you know you're going to use it the next day. And yes, I did set all the pieces of wood in my kitchen because again, I planned to set them outside, but dust storm hit and it didn't work out well. So So I ended up putting him in my kitchen. It's a good thing I'm single, because if I was married to me, I probably would have killed me. And this is what the finished product looked like after 2 coats, or I should say 2 good coats. You can see that it's nice and shiny. It's a nice finish on it. All the impurities in the wood are filled in. It's a nice smooth surface. That way you don't have any friction while you're trying to play your game, and you can get nice large stacks out of your Jenga games. Have a good day, everybody.